Welcome to this tape. I'm going to be dealing with dangerous mental illnesses and character disorders. A very, very important topic that affects all counselors, pastors, and those who work with people. People with mental disorders rarely ever make the news, except when they do something that's harmful to someone else. The fact is that the overwhelming majority of mentally disordered people now live in dignity, free of suffering and fear. But whenever anything goes wrong and someone with a mental disorder does something that is harmful to someone else, it sure does get the media's attention, and they will splash headlines all about how some crazy person has done some harm to someone else. Well, I want to address this topic. I want to talk about how you can tell when someone is dangerous and what you should do, how you should refer someone with such a disorder. Research has shown that the vast majority of violent people do not suffer from a mental illness. So let's get this clear. Many people who are dangerous don't suffer from a diagnosable mental illness. They are just ordinary people who somehow have lost it. However, there is a small group of those with serious, persistent disorders that are at risk of becoming violent. They threaten, they hurt, they fight, and they can even kill someone else. So it is important for all of us who work with other people to be alert to and aware of the signs of someone who is dangerous. Now, right at the outset, we have to admit that we have a problem here. And the problem is that it is virtually impossible to predict exactly who is dangerous. There is no special way, no special ability that can consistently detect dangerous behaviors. Studies by the American Psychological Association have shown that even when there is a history of violence, predictions are wrong 2 times out of 3. There are too many variables, you see. Bio, social, spiritual, psychological variables, and these all contribute to determining whether someone is going to be dangerous or not. So we will examine 3 areas. First of all, what types of mental illness have an increased risk for violent behavior? So that at least we can know that when a person has this particular disorder, that they are at risk for becoming violent. Secondly, we'll examine the conditions under which the risk of violent behavior goes up. In other words, notwithstanding what the disorder is, what are the conditions in the person's life, perhaps? What are the situations that could raise the risk of violent behavior? And then thirdly, we will look at specific pathologies that have a high risk associated with them. But before I proceed, let's look at some fundamental issues. Firstly, I want to address the difference in attitudes that exists between the United States, say, and other parts of the world, notably Britain, towards dangerous behaviors on the part of mentally disordered people. The rest of the world considers us in the United States to be very lax. We have a far greater incidence of people who do violent things against others in our country than you see in most other countries. Our system is lax because we give priority to individual rights. We allow the person, the individual, to have a right not to be misjudged, not to be misaccused. And this emphasis on individual rights has its good, its bad, and its ugly side. So let's look at those quickly to set the stage for what I want to say. There's a good side to this individual right emphasis we have. And the good side is that it does safeguard us against abusing those with mental disorders and who might otherwise be quite harmless in their behavior. Right now in the United Kingdom, there is a proposal that dangerous psychopaths can be locked up indefinitely even if they haven't committed a crime. I mean, that is how seriously a country like England takes this sort of problem. Now, the good side of our system is that that we don't lock up people unnecessarily. We don't take people who have not yet done anything bad and lock them up. But now the bad side to all of this is that we release a lot of people who are dangerous, who can be predicted to be dangerous, and then who go and do harmful things. One example, of course, are sexual predators, those with serious disorders relating to their sexuality. They will very often murder children, and we see some serious harm coming there because we are so lax, someone else pays. And then there's the ugly to the system, and that is the legal system is often blinded to the real dangers. And the sad thing is that we cannot always rely on the legal system to protect us, to protect our children, our wives, our friends from the harm that can be done to them by someone who has a mental disorder or a character disorder. So it's in that context, therefore, that we as counselors, as pastors, as people helpers, need to be more aware of the risks that exist and learn as much as we can about how we can identify those who are likely to be dangerous. There are 3 levels of danger. The first level, perhaps the lowest level, if we could put it into a hierarchy, is a danger which I call just mere aggravation. These are people who make life miserable for others. I've got a few neighbors like that. But it could be a little more serious. I mean, spousal abuse would be a case, elder abuse, stalkers, etc. Many of these types of behaviors are aggravations. However, they can move up a step higher than that, because the second level that we need to consider is where someone is harmful to themselves. So, aggravation, they're just difficult to live with. Secondly, they are actually harmful to themselves. People who mutilate themselves, self-mutilators. There's a lot of problems right now in teenage girls who are into self-mutilating as a way of sort of punishing or appeasing some pain within themselves. Suicide would be an example where the danger is to oneself, even though others might not be affected by it. And then thirdly, there are those who are harmful to others. And I suppose that will be the group that we are primarily concerned with in this tape that we're presenting now. They're harmful to others. There are women who suffer from postpartum psychosis who drown little children. And you are familiar with a recent case. Just very recently, there was a mother who bashed the heads in of 2 of her children who died. The third one escaped dying. And these are behaviors that are extremely dangerous to others. And we will examine the conditions under which the danger increases and talk a bit about what we can do to prevent the harm that they can cause. In the final analysis, however, let me say that all such harms others. There's no such thing as it harming just me or you, but we are all harmed by it. Now, there are 3 levels of response that we need to be aware of. As a people helper, a counselor or a pastor, there are 3 ways in which we can help. Firstly, we can help the system, and by that I mean the local system, the community, the churches, the environment, the immediate environment in which such a person exists, to be more tolerant. There are some people who are just aggravating. They are difficult people. They might even be eccentrics, but they don't harm others so much as they harm themselves. And we can prevent such behaviors from becoming more dangerous if we can teach the system, our local communities, our churches, to be more tolerant and understanding of these behaviors. Because it's very clear that when someone is evidencing eccentric behavior that might be harmful to themselves, they will often become violent when the system is not very tolerant. It's their way of protesting the fact that we don't understand them. Then the second level of response is that we can facilitate some sort of intervention strategy. We can confront, we can force certain people to get help. Very often with an extreme alcoholic, one might get the whole family together and do a family confrontation where you virtually say to someone, we want you to get help, and we will do everything we can to help you, even to the extent that we might have to limit your privileges, restrict your privileges in order to ensure that you get help. Our goal is simply to bring some healing to such a person. Then the third level of response is to mobilize legal or criminal prevention. We have a duty to warn. If we know or have some suspicion that someone is out to harm another, then we have a duty to warn that person, warn the legal system, call the police or something, in order to avoid that danger from being acted out. This is a good example would be child abuse. If we know that someone within a family system is a child abuser, then we have a responsibility to bring that out into the open and invoke whatever criminal action or other method in order to bring damage control. The goal here is to marginalize the danger. But before I go into and talk about the dangerous aspect of mental disorders, there are 3 myths about mental illness I do want to address and make sure that our attitudes towards these people are healthy. Attitude to mental illness is not very helpful in many quarters. In some churches, for example, mentally ill people are shunned as if they are contagious and that you're likely to catch the illness. Well, that's one of the myths that needs to be debunked, the idea that somehow the illness is contagious, that it is incurable, that it is lifelong, and none of that is really true. None of that is true. Not in this day and age when we have such effective treatment for many of these disorders. Mental illness is curable. Mental illness does not have to be a lifelong handicap. Also, a myth that anyone can develop mental illness is nonsense. Many mental illnesses have a strong genetic factor in determining their creation, and these genes are understood and to some extent can be predicted in what its effects might be. And then the last myth I want to just mention and see if I can get it off your agenda is the idea that mental illness will always come back again and again and again. And that's not true either. That's not true either. The vast majority of people who suffer from a diagnosable mental illness will probably only have it for one period only and may never return again, or twice perhaps, and it will never return again. And especially if they get treatment for it, the disorder can be brought under control. All right, now let's turn to the types of mental illnesses that have an increased risk of danger. There are 3 types of deficiencies that creates the conditions under which someone can become dangerous. The first condition is a neurological impairment. In other words, something is wrong with the brain. An example of this is a disorder called Huntington's chorea. It's a genetic disorder where the brain starts to shrink, and slowly it's a progressive illness. And at a certain point, the people with this disorder don't really fully understand or know what they are doing, and they could do something dangerous. Another disorder under this category would be a head injury, where, and it's not always an injury that opens the head. We call it a closed head injury, where you just bump your head rather hard, but the damage that is caused, in fact, any damage to the brain has the potential, under certain conditions, to lead to dangerous behavior. So that's the first group. The second group are the psychoses. This is when there is a gross impairment in reality testing, where one is not aware of what is going on. The mother who drowned her children thought that she was actually giving them a blessing, doing something good for them. That's how distorted her perception of reality was. The psychoses usually have they are usually people who have hallucinations and sometimes visions. Now, there's a difference between a vision and a hallucination. And visions usually occur in people who have some damage to the temporal lobe, the sides of the brain, and alcohol can be a serious aggravator of that. So someone who has such a disorder, who then consumes alcohol, can easily get into an uncontrollable rage, and out of that rage, do something harmful to someone else. I remember a case in the early years of my practice that I was involved with, where a man who had, on a train, had pulled out a gun. He had been drinking rather heavily, pulled out a gun, and in a rage walked down the train, shooting at everybody he could shoot at. And when he came to trial, I happened to be closely associated with the person who was giving testimony, a professional person. They found, by giving him an EEG, that he in fact had damage in his temporal lobe, and were able to demonstrate that every time they gave him some alcohol, there was seizure activity in these parts of the brain. And so alcohol can aggravate these sorts of disorders. And then the third general category of behaviors that are dangerous is in the realm of the personalities. Now, the personality disorders, and I will come back and deal with some of these in a little more detail, the personality disorders really don't have anything organically wrong. There's nothing wrong with the brain. It's just, as the label implies, a personality. It's something that is there from very early on, but it has to do with behaviors and attitudes that are deeply ingrained, but they are distorted and puts you out of step with everybody else, and therefore makes you a dangerous person as well. Now, under what conditions can these behaviors be more dangerous? People with mental illness who are raised or exposed to violent surroundings become at greater risk for violent behaviors. So as a counselor, you should be very aware of, you should at least, in taking a good history, look for background or exposure, or to what extent has this person been abused, him or herself. Because when that has happened in someone with a mental disorder, the chances of dangerous behavior goes up. So you look for evidence of a violent background. Secondly, people with an adequate lack of social support who have mental disorder, their risk of dangerous behavior also goes up. That's because they don't have a social support. There are not people around them who are helping to keep them in check. There is no accountability. And without accountability, the risk of dangerous behavior goes up in someone with a mental disorder. The third aggravation is stress. Someone with a mental disorder, if you aggravate them through stress, you tend to put up the danger level. Fourthly, the unsatisfactory side effects of major psychotropic medications, that's the medications given to people with mental disorders. Some of the side effects of those medications can also give rise to dangerous behaviors. Now, who is the target of the attack? Always, or nearly always, it's a family member. Those who are closest to the one who is ill. The very ones on whom they depend are the ones that they will turn on. And within the family, it is the mother who is at greatest risk. You do not hear very much about someone who is mentally disordered attacking or killing a husband. Invariably, it is the wife, the mother, who is the target. One study has shown that 65% of mentally disordered people who were dangerous had in fact attacked another family member. Strangers are seldom the ones who are attacked. All right, now let's look at specific disorders that are at risk. Now there's a long list of them, so I will have to be selective, and I will touch on those that I consider to be the highest in priority and mention what and why they are dangerous. The top of the list for me is depression, serious depression. Suicide, of course, is the greatest risk here. But severely depressed people don't only kill themselves, they might also kill someone else in the act. They could easily, in driving a car, decide to kill themselves, but in the process, kill whoever else is in the car as well. About half of all suicides are diagnosed with depression. It's one of the 10 top causes of death in the United States. About 5 million people have survived a suicide attempt. Because what is interesting here is that, in fact, women are more likely to attempt suicide if they are depressed. Women are more likely to attempt it, but they're not always as successful. Men will not attempt it as often, but because they are so successful when they do it, I mean, after all, they don't fool around here. They choose pretty violent means. They either shoot or stab or do something that is final. But in fact, the end result is that men die from suicide more often than women do. Now, what increases? Why is there an increased risk of suicide in depression? Well, obviously, it's because there's an impaired ability to think. You're not thinking clearly. You are negative. You are sad. You see no hope. You feel hopeless. And this combination gives you a death wish. You wish you were dead. You go to bed at night and you just wish that during the night you would die, and then it doesn't happen, and finally you do it yourself. Unfortunately, I've seen quite a few suicides in my time. Patients in the past, haven't for some time now, fortunately, but patients in the past who have committed suicides. I've had 2 friends, colleagues, both psychologists, who have committed suicide, and it always is a shock. And my message is very clear. Don't underestimate the power of depression. Don't underestimate it. Next in order of disorders that are at risk for being dangerous would be the disorder of schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is a very serious psychotic disorder. About 1% of the population suffers from schizophrenia. Now, that's rather high, I think, 1 out of every 100 people. Whenever I'm walking down the street, I count 1, 2, and then every 100 I say, well, that person's probably schizophrenic. I do that just to remind myself that this is not an uncommon problem. One study has shown that schizophrenics are 9 times more likely than the general population to pick a fight with somebody else. They are 22 times more likely to use a weapon when they pick a fight. So this means that a counselor has to be particularly on guard when working with someone who is schizophrenic, and assuming that that person has been referred for the appropriate medication and is on medication for the disorder. Nevertheless, one has to be alerted to the risk of danger. And remember that the problem with schizophrenia is the symptoms wax and wane. 1 day, 2 days, it may seem the person is quite normal, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, it turns dangerous. So one has to be vigilant. One has to be on guard and looking for any evidence that there is a dangerous trend developing. And you can usually tell it from the way they talk, the stories they tell. If they start to make accusations, if they start to make threats, even though it may not be directly to the person, they might just be talking about it to you, you need to understand that they are at risk. There's one particular type of schizophrenia that is the highest level of risk, and that is paranoid schizophrenia. And in paranoid schizophrenia, that is, I hope you know, of course, where you have a lot of paranoid delusions. The FBI is chasing you, that people are out to get you, that people are poisoning your food, that people are pumping gas through the ventilators into your room. These sorts of paranoid delusions are very, very prognostic of danger, because with that sort of delusional system, you easily take the initiative and attack backwards. In fact, some research has shown with schizophrenics that they did not realize that they were provoking the attack. They thought they were merely reacting in defense. And that's how distorted their thinking can be. Now, the biggie, the real biggie, the one that we need to be aware of, perhaps even more so than those that I've discussed thus far, are the personality disorders. Now, the personality disorders are important for counselors to keep in mind, because these disorders are not the sort of disorders that typically gets a person to a psychiatrist or gets a person on medication to control the behavior. These people often live incognito. They manage to exist in the communities around us. We might realize there's a little bit something strange here, but we don't always recognize them for what they are. Put it another way, what I'm saying is that many serious personality disorders never come to the attention of mental health workers, never gets diagnosed for the serious problem that it is. Now, as opposed to the psychotic disorders, in the personality disorders, there is no loss of control with reality. These are people who live ordinary lives. They are not psychotic, but their personality traits are lifelong, so this is not something that comes and goes. Many mental disorders will be there for a time, and then they will stop, they will go away. Even schizophrenics will, at some points, be free of any evidence of their disorder. But these personality disorders, the group of personality disorders that are likely to be a problem for us, have one common feature. And I'm hoping to share this with you as a counselor, because I can assure you, if you can grasp this point, you really will have a good handle on how and where personality disorders become dangerous. The unique characteristic of these personality disorders is that they do not experience any anxiety. That means they feel no guilt. That means that if they harm you, they don't feel bad. That means they can't even tell ahead of time that what they're going to do is going to be harmful to you. They are totally lacking in guilt. Sometimes we call this condition cortical immaturity, because not only do they have the thinking pattern of a child, in the sense that they don't see how dangerous some their behaviors are, but they also have a distinctive brainwave pattern that is not typical, is not as you see in an adult, but as you see in a child. Just so happens that I've done quite a bit of work with these people, so I know this condition fairly well. So they can appear perfectly normal, rational, intelligent. Their personality disorder is such that it tends to put them at odds with society. Now, of these personality disorders, there are 3 or 4 that I think are important for you to be aware of. And on top of the list of these personality disorders, I would put the borderline personality disorder. Now, the borderline personality disorder is a fascinating one. Essentially, this person is very unstable. Their mood is unstable. One day they're high, and the next day they are extremely low. Well, you say, well, most of us are like that, and that's true. Some days I feel high, some days I feel low. But we're talking about extreme fluctuations in mood, unpredictable fluctuations in mood. If you talk to me on a Monday morning, I'm bound to be a little bit down. My weekend is over. I love my weekends. I love being with my family. And Monday morning usually means work and stuff like that. And so my mood is down. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about unpredictable mood variations. And not only does the mood fluctuate up and down, but their anger fluctuates. It can be very intense. They are unstable. They are in conflict with everyone. If someone comes to you and they tell you they've got a lawsuit against this person and that counselor and that doctor and that dentist and you have a long list of people that they have lawsuits going against, you think borderline personality disorder, because this is the sort of thing that people like this do. Recurring lawsuits, recurring accidents. They get into accidents a lot, and it's never their fault. It's always somebody else's fault. Now, this can be damaging. They can make life not just miserable for others, but make life dangerous for others, because on an impulse, these are people who act on impulse. On an impulse, they can attack someone else. And interestingly, that when they are thwarted, when they are blocked, when you do something that prevents them from getting what they want, they can become extremely dangerous. A second personality disorder that you need to be aware of is, in the popular press it's called psychopath, but we might label it as an antisocial personality disorder. Psychopath is a legal term. That's what the law has labeled these people, because they are, interestingly, very commonly found in the criminal system. They're in our jails, in our prisons, and they are dangerous in the sense that they will do dangerous things to others without realizing what they are doing. They are, as I mentioned to you earlier, they feel no guilt. They don't feel bad. They'll rob you blind, stab you in the back, betray you, and they'll walk away from it and don't feel not a bit of anxiety or guilt whatsoever. They have another interesting characteristic, and that is that they never learn from experience. They never benefit from experience. Most of us, a normal person like you and I, if we did something and we were punished for it, we would say to ourselves, you know, shouldn't do that again. I will avoid doing that. But these are people who will rob somebody, be arrested, be taken to be booked, bailed out, and walk out of the prison, out of the police station virtually, and go and rob someone else again. They never benefit from experience. They can't feel bad at hurting anyone. They are too self-absorbed and therefore become dangerous. Now, someone with these characteristics should be referred to a psychiatrist right away. I think your responsibility is to get them to whatever help is available to them. Unfortunately, there is not a lot one can do. These conditions don't respond to any medications of any sort, unfortunately. But there are certain psychotherapeutic techniques that can be utilized to help these people. And I'm going to come back in a little while and share with you some of the ways in which people like this can be helped. There's another personality disorder that can alert you to danger, and it's called intermittent explosive disorder. And by the very title of it, by the very name of it, you can figure out what this disorder is about. This is the person who has lost all control over aggressive impulses. They are explosive. They seriously assault you. They destroy property. They can be walking down the street one evening and then on an impulse just suddenly feel like throwing a match underneath a motor car where some oil has been dripping and starting a fire, and walk on as if nothing had happened. This intermittent explosive disorder has a sudden onset, so therefore you can't predict it. And often the onset, the reason for the rage attack, this sudden explosive attack, has no connection with what has been going out of there. You might say something very innocently to this person, and the next thing they explode and then act in some violent way towards you. This sort of disorder needs to be watched very carefully, because I happen to believe that a high percentage of people in this category have what I mentioned earlier, a temporal lobe dysfunction. That's the part of the brain called the temporal lobes. It's a disorder that often occurs in childbirth, when the brain doesn't get enough oxygen, and that part of the brain suffers from that. And in these people, alcohol is frequently the trigger. It's alcohol that provokes or lowers the threshold for rage, and these people go into a sudden attack of rage without any provocation whatsoever. We need to watch for this sort of disorder and get the person to whatever appropriate help is available to them at that moment. A good place to start is always with a psychiatrist, but if they won't go to psychiatrists, well, then suggest that they just see their general physician as a starting point. There's yet another disorder that is dangerous that I'd like to mention, and that is something called Munchausen by proxy. Sometimes called a factitious disorder by proxy. By proxy means you're doing something on behalf of somebody else. It's a disorder often found in women, in mothers, where they deliberately and intentionally make a child sick by poisoning them, by putting a pillow over their head if they're babies so they can't get enough oxygen, causing some sort of problem. They make the child sick and then present the sick child in some way in order to get sympathy for themselves. But of course, every now and again, something goes wrong. The child dies, or the child suffers from permanent brain damage from the oxygen that's been withheld. And this then can be the source of severe consequences and dangerous to the victims. The victim is often a preschooler, so that because the child has to be fairly young and really not know what is going on, doesn't know that the mother is in fact feeding him or her some poison in order to make their stomach system upset, to find a reason to take them to the doctor. Now, in this sort of disorder, this Munchausen by proxy, the disorder, there is no economic gain. They're not doing it in order to make money. They are doing it solely for the purpose of getting medical attention and making someone else sick in the process. And of course, this is a very dangerous disorder. It occurs in otherwise normal people. These are normal people. Looking at them, you wouldn't think there was any serious disorder. They're often happily, well, not happily married, but satisfactorily married. The husband doesn't seem to realize there is anything wrong until finally, often by secretly videotaping such a person, they're able to demonstrate exactly what it is this person is doing. Now, of course, this is a dangerous behavior, and we need to take immediate steps the moment we discover it. And then, lastly, of the mental disorders that I wanted to discuss is the disorder of postpartum psychosis. Now, this is an interesting one. Just recently, the American Association of Christian Counselors, our regular journal, the Christian Counseling Today journal, we featured this disorder in the whole edition. It was shortly after the Andrea Yates case, and we were able to interview her husband, talk with him about what was going on, what he felt, why it was that they missed, or the professionals missed foreseeing the danger. But not only has the Yates case elevated our awareness of this problem, but there have been, as I mentioned earlier, some other more recent cases where postpartum psychosis has led to the death of children. And you know, even if the disorder doesn't give rise to killing any children, it does give rise to a very unhappy environment in which to raise a child, so that there can be emotional damage, not just physical damage, that we as counselors need to be on the lookout for. Now, the postpartum psychosis, which is the much more serious form of postpartum depression, the depression that follows postpartum, after the birth of a baby. Postpartum depression is on the increase. We're looking possibly at one out of every 4 or 5 births where the mother will experience some depression following the birth of her child. That has to do with a dramatic drop in the estrogen level after you give birth to a baby, and the estrogen level drops, pulls down the serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter that when it's depleted causes depression, and so women go into this depression. And it's becoming more common, I believe, because stress is so high in all our lives these days. But postpartum psychosis is somewhat different and certainly more serious, and only occurs in about 1 or 2 births per 1,000, whereas postpartum depression is at least 13% on the increase. I think it's probably up to more like 25% now. So it's rare. It is a loss of contact with reality. That's the important point. The person is delusional. They're living in another world. They think that they're sending these children to heaven to be with God and freeing them from the pain of life. And this distorted reality is what makes them dangerous. And often they're doing it right under the noses of their loved ones, close to pastors who are ministering to these people. And it's not being recognized as it should be, which was one of the reasons why we've put this tape together, in order to alert counselors and lay counselors and pastors who counsel to be aware of these dangerous conditions. Now, the postpartum psychosis usually presents in the first 2 or 3 weeks. That's when you need to be on the lookout for it. It needs urgent attention, urgent treatment, and it can be treated. There's usually a history of prior psychosis of some sort, or a pre-existing condition of bipolar disorder, that's depression and mania. that can also predispose one to postpartum psychosis. Let's look at some of the treatment options that are available to us. I'll talk about psychopharmacology first of all, because that's one of my areas of expertise. Psychopharmacology is, we have very effective medications available for the treatment of psychotic disorders, for the treatment of depression disorders. We have very effective medications. In fact, just recently, our treatment of the psychotic disorders has increased tremendously. I was recently at an update workshop where I was able to get some of the information coming out about the newer medications that are coming to us. And I was so heartened. It was such a wonderful thing to see what I believe God is making available through science to us to relieve our pain and our suffering. And they are very, very effective treatments. However, there is still a strong resistance in Christian circles, particularly the evangelical sector of the church, to which I identify, still a very strong resistance towards the use of medication under these conditions. We need to understand that these disorders have a biological cause. They are as seriously medical in their origin as diabetes could be, or any other disorder of the body. And medications are the effective ways in which these disorders can be treated. And so part of the role that we have as counselors and pastors is to educate our people into understanding that these medications are not only necessary and effective, but do not carry with them the risks that the stereotypic way of thinking seems to indicate. But now, when it comes to the personality disorders, these medications are of no use to us whatsoever. Personality disorders are can be very dangerous, but because they are embedded in the personality, there really is nothing wrong with the brain, with the chemistry of the brain. And so you can tranquilize them, you can put them to sleep if you want to, you can turn them into zombies, which are sometimes the ways the medications have been abused in treating these people. But the fact is, the bottom line of what I'm wanting to say is that in the personality disorders, we are entirely beholden to psychotherapy, to good counseling, to address these problems. So doing psychotherapy with personality disorders is the only option we have. It's not good news, because treating people like this, and I have been involved in treatment of many personality disorders, I must say not with a great degree of success. Although we've got to be careful how you define success in personality disorders. Success in personality disorder is not changing the personality, because you can't do that. Success in treating a personality disorder is bringing the behavior under control, damage control. That is the key to your outcome. So psychotherapy is the choice. Be prepared. It's going to be very time consuming. It's going to be very demanding. It's going to appear bleak many times. I have come out of sessions with patients like this who want to pull my hair out. And why do I even bother? Because you seem to make so little progress. These people lack motivation to change. They lack the insight that is needed to change. They lack the anxiety that is needed. Do you know that anxiety is what keeps us normal? Anxiety is what keeps me normal. Because I know if I do certain things, there will be bad consequences. My anxiety goes up, so I don't do those things. And so to be normal, you really need to have a measure of anxiety going inside you. And these people don't have that. They lack concern for the consequences. They're not even aware of what the consequences can be. They lack empathy. And the best option is to use some sort of group therapy, where you bring in peer pressure. When you have a group of psychopaths together and with some other people with whom they relate on a peer level, you can begin to use peer pressure to bring control on their behavior. This means that invariably this sort of treatment can only be offered in an institutional setting, where you can have a controlled environment. It's often called milieu therapy, a controlled environment where you have rewards and punishments for certain behaviors. And we call that behavior modification, where little bits of rewards, you almost treat them like children again. I mean, that's how simple the procedure is. Now, short of psychotherapy, which is not highly effective, not at the present time at any rate, short of whatever prayer we can mobilize, and please don't underestimate the power of prayer here. I strongly encourage that we be praying for people like this, so that God can intervene in their lives. We need to be aware of the fact that very dangerous patients need to be detained. As I said earlier, we have a duty to warn. And it may appear cruel, it may appear unjust, it may even appear unchristian. But when the lives of other people are at risk, or the limbs of other people are at risk, or the peace of mind of other people is at risk, we have a responsibility to limit that damage. And in that case, we need to move out and invoke whatever legal process we have. There are legal systems available. The police have certain powers to detain and hold people who are dangerous. And we, and you and I, need to be courageous enough to invoke that help when it is needed. And my prayer for all of you is that you will have great wisdom and have God's guidance in your lives as you seek to minister to those who have dangerous mental disorders. God bless you.